Hello, this is Michael Thompson, and today I'm going to be presenting on the topic of the fall of Singapore. This is for the class Introduction to World War II under Professor Maniates. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the Japanese reasons for attacking and why they decided to attack Singapore in specific. So the general Southeast Asia area, including Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Malaysia, Indonesia, was considered the southern resource region by the Japanese military and government. It had a lot of valuable resources that would be required for war efforts and continuing the war in China, where they become very bogged down and much of their resources had been tied down, and they were losing lots of resources to that fight in China. At the same time, this invasion of Singapore would also help create a defensive buffer against counterattacks from nations like Australia, America, and the British in India. And what really pushed them to make this decision to attack Singapore and Southeast Asia in specific was the need for resources after American embargoes cut them off from a lot of their natural resources needed for the war effort. And what really also encouraged this was a realization that the European nations were really weak as of now. The Netherlands had just been completely conquered by Germany, and Britain had been reduced to only its homeland and was constantly under attack by the German Air Force at this time. Another thing was they wanted to emulate that German success in Europe. They didn't want to miss the bus, as it was being said in the Japanese government at the time. So we need to go a little more in depth on these American diplomatic actions that would eventually drive Japan on this new war path, after driving them first into a corner when it came to resources. Japan's war machine was dependent not only on U.S. oil, but also other materials such as scrap metal, which they would use to create rifles, vehicles, planes, warships. So really, Japan's entire war production was stalled without these U.S. resources being shipped in. These embargoes completely threw the Japanese government and military into chaos. They knew they could not keep going without these resources coming in. So at first, Japan decided to take a little more of a diplomatic approach. They sent a proposal where they offered a partial pullback from China. They would still keep Manchuria, but all other offensive gains would be given up, as well as several other concessions, such as making peace with China, for the time being, they thought. Now, the U.S. government, and especially Roosevelt personally, delayed a couple of days looking into this proposal. And by the time they got it, it was late November. And so Japan's panicking. They know that each and every day that passes, they are growing weaker and weaker as their oil reserves are used up. On the other hand, America grows stronger and stronger in its position both diplomatically and militarily as the days pass. So, Japan would eventually decide to initiate their southern offensives after they attacked Pearl Harbor, the day after they attacked Pearl Harbor. So, all these offensives are initiated. And an early target of these offensives is Singapore. It's in an essential strategic position. It's a big base from which the British operate out of. It needs to be taken out early, or else other offensives could be stalled or completely scrapped, because Singapore would throw a wrench in their plans. So before the Japanese even reached Singapore, they had to conquer Malaysia itself. All this opened up with Japanese troops landing in Thailand and a couple areas in northern Malaysia and advancing south. Before this had even happened, Percival, the overall commander of British forces in Malaysia, delayed an offensive operation called Operation Matador. By delaying this, it kept his troops out of position, and it kept them in an exposed place where they could not fortify, but they also could not move forward to attack Japanese troops. And eventually he would just trash this operation, meaning that time wasted waiting on his decision completely obliterated any chance the British had of holding northern Malaysia. And especially in the jungle warfare, The British were consistently outflanked. They did not extend their lines into the jungle itself, and Japanese troops would exploit this, going around their lines that would really go just a couple of meters into the jungle on either side of the road. The speed with which the Japanese advanced was so quick that many Japanese soldiers would seize bikes to be able to keep up the pace. They were constantly advancing. There was really very few moments where the Japanese advances were stopped. They maybe held up a day, maybe two here and there, but overall they are just constantly marching forward, rolling over these British defenses and pushing the British further and further along. And especially a very big deciding factor in Japanese success was Japanese tanks. The British had no answer to these. They had anti-tank guns, but they often weren't exploited and used the best, and they had no tanks with which they could use to combat Japanese tanks. So small Japanese tank forces would be able to smash through British front lines, advance really deep behind these lines, and cut off British soldiers by taking bridges such as at the Slim River. And with all these defeats, these constant setbacks after setback after setback, the British were eventually forced back to Singapore itself. And on the 31st of January, they would blow up the causeway that connected Singapore to mainland Malaysia, and essentially the Battle of Singapore was about to begin. So next we're going to look at the combatants themselves, their army compositions and situations. So for Japan, they had sent the 25th Army, consisting of the 5th, 18th, and Imperial Guards divisions, with around 30,000 military personnel, to go and take Malaysia and then continue on to Singapore. To back this up, they had also sent many aircraft, and they were using the airfields captured in northern Malaysia to give themselves complete control of the sky. They also sent along the 1st, 6th, and 14th Tank Regiments, which all participated and assisted in advancing down the Malaysian peninsula and towards Singapore. And they would see action on Singapore Island as well. Now, to look at their situation, they knew that there was this massive victory right within their grasp. They were buoyed high after all these successes, and they knew they were right there. They were almost done. All these troops were extremely experienced. They had seen action in China. They were crack troops. They were some of the best troops in the Japanese army available at the time. They had all been trained in jungle warfare, which had assisted them in their Malaysian campaign and would assist them again on Singapore Island, which was really dominated in the west by these jungles. However, at the same time, their supply lines were stretched pretty thin. Their rapid advance had brought them outside of the range where their transports could really keep up with them for a little bit. By the time they reached Singapore, they were running quite low on ammunition especially. So they needed to keep this speed going and to just get this done. They needed to get it over with. Okay, so now we're going to turn and look at the British. They had roughly 70,000 combat personnel in Singapore at the time of the battle. This was divided among the British 18th Division, which was the freshest unit. They had recently arrived to bolster the defenses of Singapore. And then they also had the 8th Australian Division, which had done a lot of the hard fighting in Malaysia itself. They had been constantly involved in the defense since they had arrived, so they were battered. They were reduced in number. So they had just received a large influx of raw recruits, which were not prepared for frontline combat. Also, there were the Indian 3rd Corps, as well as the Indian 9th and 11th Divisions. These were not the greatest quality units. These were the units that were selected to go to a lighter duty front rather than a front, say, like North Africa, where the fighting was fierce and they needed to be really well prepared for battle. Also, the British had scraped together a Malaya and Strait Settlements volunteer units. These units were not the greatest quality. They would, however, prove their worth, but they were more of a desperate measure in order to shore up British defenses at this point. Now, turning to their situation, they were not in a good place. Morale was extremely low because they had just been beaten around, really, by these Japanese soldiers advancing down Malaysia. And a lot of this was due to a lack of training. in most of these troops. This was not a very important front to the British at the time, and they had come to regret that now. And very few of them were actually adapted to the hot, humid climate of this jungle terrain they were fighting in. Also, another thing that very much affected British ability to fight was the very poor communication between units, between commanders. It was just everywhere. Small mistakes would snowball, and all of a sudden you have troops pulling back before they were needed to, or advancing when they shouldn't have, and it was really destroying the British ability to defend themselves. Another thing to note was less than half of these troops really frontline quality units. They were not supposed to be fighting in this massive battle. They were supposed to be these leisure units that were just kind of defending and garrisoning a British colony. But obviously, they had been forced into this situation by the Japanese attack. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at the commanders of the Japanese and British respectively. So first, for the British, we have Arthur Percival. What really dominated Singapore and Malaysia was his indecisiveness. He couldn't really commit to a decision sometimes, and this would definitely cost him a lot during this battle. But at the same time, he was given an almost impossible task by the British government. They had put him in a situation where he had troops that were not prepared for combat, and they were going up against these professional Japanese troops. And he had very few air defenses. He had commanded in Malaysia before, which was kind of why he was selected for this role. And then another very important factor was he lacked a lot of senior staff to support him and be able to distribute his orders effectively and quickly. But at the same time, his orders were often very vague, and we would see that definitely change the course of this battle. Now, turning to the Japanese, they had Tomoyuki Yamashita. He had been a lifelong soldier in the Japanese military. He knew what he was doing, and he also knew he needed to win, because he was not on good terms with the Japanese leader, Hideki Tojo. This factionalism affected his decisions a lot, especially with his need for speed attitude. However, he did have a very good supporting staff with professional senior officers in all of his divisions, and could depend on their support from the Japanese mainland. So next, we're going to take a look at the battlefield itself, Singapore Island. This 14 by 26 mile wide island was very, very flat. It had two major hills, the largest of which rose up only 581 feet. The west side of the island was dominated by these mangroves and swamps, which were broken up by creeks and rivers, but it was very thick, difficult to maneuver in terrain. Also on the western side of the island was the largest air base, Tenga. Turning to the eastern side of the island, you had the naval base, which was the entire reason Britain had decided to defend Singapore, but it was now made useless by Japanese artillery right on the other side of the strait. Looking to the south, you have Singapore City, which was where the British would make their final stand, and a lot of the prepared defenses, such as the famous naval guns of Singapore Island that got it its name, Fortress Singapore, were prepared on the southern coast of the island, making them mostly useless. Some of the artillery was able to turn and fire the other way. However, they lacked ammunition, especially high explosive. These armor-piercing rounds they had had specifically for combating incoming navies were kind of useless against ground forces. So next, we're going to look at the separate strategies Britain and Japan had for the Battle of Singapore. For Britain, Percival wanted to defend the entire coastline. He anticipated an attack from the east, so his better units were placed over there, such as the British 18th. However, defending the whole coast really spread his defenses thin, especially in the western portion of the island, where it would turn out the Japanese actually would attack from. In particular, the 8th Australian, which had already been battered, beaten, and now had a bunch of raw recruits, was on the western side, and they were strung out. There were a couple of hundred yards between each post these Australians had to make. And also, they only had one reserve brigade. There was only one unit left in reserve to help shore up any defenses, and Percival was pretty unwilling to maneuver around a lot of his other defensive troops early on in the battle. Turning to Japan, speed, and more speed were key to the Japanese strategy. They were low on ammunition and they needed to finish this battle as quickly as possible. They were going to press hard on these British defenders. Their attack would come on the western portion of the island, with a portion of the Imperial Guards crossing right next to the causeway the British had blown up. The attack would happen at night to minimize casualties, and they would use a lot of barges and other boats they could find and get their hands on to transport troops and supplies across the straits. So now we're going to look at the battle itself, which would begin on February 8th. Starting around 10:30, 10ish in the morning, a 12-hour-long artillery bombardment by the Japanese would pummel the Australian defenders on the western side of the island. And crucially, Percival did not believe this was going to be an attack. He still thought the attack was going to be in the east. Late at night, a 4,000-strong first wave of Japanese soldiers would begin crossing the Johor Strait. At first, Australian defenders would be able to effectively cut down these incoming Japanese soldiers. However, for one reason or another, the beach lights would not be turned on, so they would not be able to see all of the boats coming in, and a lot of Japanese would be able to infiltrate in between these Australian defense positions and surround these defenders. The Australian 22nd Brigade, which was defending the majority of the coast, which was attacked, was thrown into retreat. It was completely chaotic. In one place, Australian units would advance and suddenly be cut down. In another, you'd just see them running from the forest. Not in panic, but just in chaos. Now, as this fighting poured over into the next day, February 9th, by 1 a.m., the Japanese would have seized all their initial objectives and would decide to continue advancing. By 10 a.m., they were right outside Tenga Airfield, and they would capture it soon after. The Indian 12th and 44th Brigades would arrive to help stem the tide from their defenses just to the south. However, this really would not stem the tide at all. They would be pushed back consistently, and Percival would refuse to send any significant reinforcements from, say, the eastern side of the island. So instead, he orders all the units in the area to retreat to the so-called Jurong Line, which was a line that had been laid out far before the battle. However, because of British confidence in defenses on Malaysia, no construction would actually be done on this defensive line, and it was really a line only in name, and the only thing that made it better than the alternatives was both flanks were covered by rivers. So all units would begin to retreat to this line. And then, just to the west of the causeway on the northern coast of the island, the Australian 27th Brigade would beat back an Imperial Guards probe that had tried to cross the Johor Straits there. And it was really an effective defense that had completely obliterated the unit of Imperial Guards that tried to cross there. So now it is February 10th, and this successful defense of the area around the causeway by the Australian 27th Brigade is really kind of stained by this sudden, unauthorized withdrawal of the Australian 27th to positions further inland. No one knows why they did it, because of their really successful defense had completely obliterated this unit of Japanese Imperial Guards just hours earlier. And so now the Jurong Line is rendered useless, as Imperial Guards units land and are outflanking it from the north. So all the units can't do their job and defend only that line. So Percival decides to lay out a final defensive perimeter that it centers around Singapore City and defends some of the reservoirs near the city to keep the city supplied with fresh water. However, once these plans are sent out to his commanders and their brigades, they are very quickly misinterpreted, especially by the 22nd Indian. The 22nd Indian would pull back to these defenses immediately, to this line, and this is not what Percival wanted. The commander had interpreted as, your positions are already useless, let's just pull back to this easier to defend position so we can effectively lay out and stall the Japanese advance. And because of this pullback, all the units to the north of the Indian 22nd Brigade would have to pull back as well, throwing the defenses into a very chaotic period. And at 11 p.m., Bukit Panjang, just up the road from Bukit Timah, a very important supply depot, would be captured. Now it's February 11th, and with the capture of Bukit Panjang late last night, Bukit Timah would fall soon after, at around 2:30 in the morning. Bukit Timah was an extremely important supply depot for the British. There was ammunition, there was food, there was water, there was all sorts of supplies here. And with its fall, it would be reported that the British had only 14 days of food left for the defense. After hearing of the capture of Bukit Timah, Yamashita would send surrender demands in the form of pamphlets dropped over Singapore City. However, he would continue to press the attack regardless. In the course of the day, the British would attempt very weak and unorganized counterattacks towards Bukit Timah in an attempt to recapture it. Also on this day, the naval guns positioned on the Singaporean coast would be able to turn enough to fire in the general direction of some Japanese troops. They would have very little effect, but it was a tiny morale boost in this very, very dark period. It's now February 12th. The day is opened with a massive Japanese attack along the entire western end of the British defenses. This attack is launched to kind of disguise the fact that the Japanese are really outnumbered at this point, and they are running low on ammunition of all sorts, artillery, rifle, machine gun, anything. And they need to push the British into surrendering as soon as possible before this ammunition runs out and they're forced to fight hand to hand. Also on this day, after a frontline inspection of several positions, Percival would order an official withdrawal to the final perimeter he had laid out. To guard this withdrawal, the 22nd Indian would be placed in a rearguard position, from which they would actually very effectively delay the Japanese advance and throw them back at times. However, once they withdrew to their positions in the final perimeter, their general would actually collapse. His General Taylor would effectively be taken out of this position of command for the rest of the battle. By now, panic was really setting in Singapore City. Citizens were realizing just how close the Japanese were to capturing the city. And before this, they had been going about their days almost as if nothing was going on, as if this battle was nowhere near them. And finally, on this day, the British 18th, the freshest and probably the best unit available to the British, is finally placed on the front lines, alleviating some of that pressure felt on that western position. February 13th. By this day, all troops enter the final perimeter laid out by Percival. However, very early on, you would start to see the British get pushed back from their positions. And this would be the day that the Japanese would seize the final reservoir that was providing fresh water to the city of Singapore. Now, the only thing that was left was a single pump house, which had pipes damaged over the course of artillery bombardments. And so the British are now very, very low on water. Also on this day, a desperate evacuation convoy consisting of pretty much every transport ship of any sort left in Singapore Harbor would depart. However, they would unluckily run into a Japanese invasion force on the way to Sumatra, and they would be destroyed, with over half the ships not making it to their final destinations. Percival would also meet with his senior staff officers in charge of his major divisions. He would ask them if they thought a counterattack could be pulled off, as he believed the Japanese at this point were in a terrible position in their own right, which he was correct in. However, his officers would all say it would be pointless and that it was impossible, and instead his divisional commanders would all agree and urge that he instead surrender in order to avoid as many casualties as possible at this point in the battle. By February 14th, desertion had crippled many of the units still fighting on the front lines. In particular, many Indians would desert from their divisions and corps. These deserters would find their way into Singapore City and would essentially wait there for the end, wait there for the British to surrender and give up. Also on this day, the Japanese 55th Regiment would enter the Alexandra Barracks Hospital and bayonet 300 patients and staff, massacring them. Anyone who was left was rounded up and shoved into tiny holding cells, where they were sometimes taken out and a few were let off into the jungle to be executed. The commanding officer of the Japanese 55th would allow some of them to escape, so they could go into Singapore City and spread word of what had happened there and urge the others to surrender so they wouldn't suffer the same fate. Also on this day, the 1st Malay Brigade would completely collapse under Japanese pressure. The remains of the unit would retreat within the city, and this would leave a gaping hole in the defenses along the southern coast of the perimeter. However, the Japanese would not be able to exploit this hole until the end of the battle. Also on this day, Percival would officially request permission to surrender from his commanding officer, General Wavell. Wavell, however, would have his hands tied by Prime Minister Churchill, who would say to continue fighting until the bitter end, even if the fighting spilled out into the city. On February 15th at 9:30 a.m., Percival would again meet with his senior staff and city officials. During the course of this meeting, Percival would receive a message that would allow him to surrender from his commanding officer, General Wavell. Immediately bringing this to the attention of the city officials and his senior staff, they would all agree that the time was now, and it was time to lay down their arms, as the situation within the city and at the defensive perimeter was rapidly deteriorating. At 11:30 a.m., Percival would gather together a party of city officials, officers, and a translator to approach Japanese lines and give the message of surrender. It would take this party roughly an hour to reach Japanese lines. Once they reached them, they would be held up by Japanese soldiers taking pictures and ordering them to pose for victory shots. Once they received the official paper that was laid out for the meeting and for the surrender, it would be extremely vague. They would have to pencil in a meeting time, which they wanted to be at 4:30 p.m. that same day. And the paper itself did not state whether or not Japanese troops would stop fighting. It would take until 3 p.m. for the party to reach Singapore itself, and they would immediately rush to raise the flag they had been given over the highest building in Singapore City, officially announcing their agreement to the terms. However, by 4 p.m., neither side would honor the ceasefire that was agreed upon in the message. The British, because their commanders had not yet handed down the orders to stop fighting, and the Japanese for unknown reasons. Percival and his staff would arrive to the agreed-upon meeting point by 4:30, and they would be driven to the Ford factory where the meeting would take place at 7 p.m. The meeting between Percival and Yamashita was extremely chaotic and tense, as both groups had different objectives, and the British in particular were confused by what the Japanese were demanding. Also contributing to the tense nature was the many translation errors and the disagreements between the groups on how fast the surrender should progress. Yamashita wanted the British to lay down their arms by 8:30 p.m. that very night. Meanwhile, Percival wanted to cease all fighting tonight, but finish the surrender terms the next morning. Yamashita would refuse this, fearing the British would reorganize and attack, which is kind of ironic as this is a tactic the Japanese may pull themselves, and is a signal of what the Japanese really expected of the Western powers. Yamashita demanded the British surrender that night or he would continue his attacks. Percival, at first, would only nod in his acquiescence to surrender. Yamashita wanted a verbal yes, a verbal agreement that would seal the deal. The translators struggled to communicate this, but eventually, after Yamashita got very angry, Percival would verbally agree and assent to Yamashita's terms of surrender, requesting that Japanese troops wait until tomorrow to enter the city. After this, Percival and his party would return to Singapore by 8:30 p.m. and immediately begin the process of surrender. The Battle of Singapore had ended. Now we're going to analyze and look at the British public reaction to the surrender at Singapore. Despite having heard most of the events that had happened in Singapore leading up to the surrender, the British public was still extremely shocked upon hearing of the surrender. There was a lot of outrage at the fact that what had been called Fortress Singapore had fallen so quickly in a very rapid manner, a humiliating manner. Churchill will give a speech on broadcast officially announcing the surrender of the defenders in Singapore, saying, "I speak to you all under the shadow of a heavy and far-reaching military defeat. It is a British and imperial defeat. Singapore has fallen. All the Malay Peninsula has been overrun." The loss of such a vital British possession in the Far East was a massive blow to prestige and morale. The fact that a nation they had considered so insignificant, in no small part due to racism against that nation, had been able to defeat them so quickly and totally scared a lot of people and humiliated them as well. The manner of this defeat really lowered British prestige a lot and brought them down a couple of pegs. And a lot of the outrage was kind of directed towards Percival himself, which the British government decided they would step back from and allow to happen, as they didn't really want to be looked at as the bad guy in the situation. And the blame game was kind of played, with everyone blaming one person or another for the surrender and the fall of Singapore itself. However, despite this, a lot of the British concerns were on the home front and the security of the British Isles themselves. So military response would have to wait, and morale was not really brought so low that they could not recover from it. So now we're going to look at a few of the strategic impacts the fall of Singapore had on the Pacific front. So first, and really most importantly, the British are sealed out of the Pacific front. Their military operations are limited to the front on Burma and India. So the British military can't assist in the operations in the Pacific itself as much. And British forces are really limited in number. In specific, their navy is not able to make as much of an impact as it might have been had it been able to operate out of Singapore naval base instead of Sri Lanka. Also, this secured the flanks of future Japanese advances, which were happening even as the battle was playing out. The Indian Ocean was also exposed now to Japanese offensive attacks, and we would see a raid on Sri Lanka and the British Navy operating there later in the war. Another big impact is Australia is ticked. The UK is who is supposed to protect them militarily and assist them in any sort of war in the Pacific. And after this, the British really can't help the Australians as effectively, and they're left sort of on their own. Also, there's a lot of anger because British blunders had just cost Australians thousands of lives and prisoners. They weren't very happy with how little the UK had done to prepare to defend this front. Instead, Australia begins to turn to the US as its new protector and ally in the region. So now we are going to look at how British colonial power was affected by the fall of Singapore. So straight off the bat, the British had been utterly defeated, totally. They had been humiliated. And this made a lot of the native people of Southeast Asia realize that colonial powers could be defeated, even in a direct confrontation. This defeat also weakened Britain's position in Southeast Asia and in Asia as a whole. They didn't have the same power over these people as they used to because they had just been kicked out so almost effortlessly by the Japanese. Also, this Japanese occupation, while still imperialist in nature, would give these natives a sample of freedom. They would be given more self-governance under Japanese rule than they had ever been given under British rule. And at the same time, Japan supported these independence movements. They would still be puppets and guided by Japan itself, but after the war had been finished, the Japanese plan was to help them create an Asian prosperity sphere in Asia that would be run by the Asian nations themselves, with Japanese obviously at its forefront. Also, Japan would help to organize a lot of these independence movements in their own way. They would gather up the people who wanted independence from places like Britain or the Netherlands, and they would form military units with the volunteers that would supplement Japanese military units in future campaigns. Resistance units would also form against Japanese rule, but these resistance movements that organized would continue the fight against the British as soon as they came back. In particular, in Malay, the Malaysian resistance, who were communists, would continue to fight the British in what was called the Malay Emergency for years after World War II had ended, in order to get their own independence. And that completes my presentation on the fall of Singapore. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an amazing day. Just for note, I did use an outside source called SlideGo for the overall layout of these slides, their design. So like the font and backgrounds. However, I did reorganize them and got all pictures on my own. Nothing else came from them other than the font, the background, and the layout of the bottoms of the slides. And then I'm just going to show you my sources real quick. These are the books, newspapers, and articles I used, and then the rest will be images. Again, thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing day.